So Bret Stephens says we can never leave the Middle East. We can never turn our back on the region. In other words, we must maintain a permanent presence in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, all the countries that we're currently occupying. He writes, and Israel will not be safe in an America-first world in which allies like the Kurds are cavalierly betrayed and enemies like Iran are haphazardly confronted. I'll read that to you again. He says, Israel will not be safe in an America-first world. That is verbatim what Bret Stephens says. And to me, the Israel-Palestine thing is not really a huge deal to me. Obviously, I care about America. We understand the ramifications of the Israel-Palestine conflict for our diplomacy with other countries in the Middle East and a number of other things, right? I mean, it is a flashpoint in the world for conflict, and there's a lot riding on the outcome of that situation. But to me, this sentence says it all, because this paragraph is not simply about Israel and Palestine, it's about the whole Middle East. Bret Stephens is painting a picture here of a foreign policy that Donald Trump has, where we're trying to withdraw from Afghanistan, we're trying to withdraw from Syria, we're trying to take our troops home, we're trying to minimize our involvement overseas and focus more on rebuilding the homeland. And Bret Stephens says this is a disaster. He is framing that as us turning our back on the Middle East and expecting them to return the favor. What exactly does that mean? It almost even sounds like an ominous statement. I mean, what is that supposed to mean? Is Bret Stephens implying that we'll be attacked? He's saying if we turn our back, we cannot expect the Middle East to reciprocate. Does that mean that they won't leave us alone? What exactly does that mean? What business do we have there? What interests do we have there? What does he mean that they won't turn their back on us? Does that mean there will be more terrorism if we turn our back on the Middle East? Is he subtly implying that if we are not currently, for example, occupying Syria for no reason at all, there would be terrorist attacks against the United States? If not for the 1,000 troops in northeastern Syria simply preventing Assad from consolidating control over his government, consolidating control over Syria, that there would be, terrorism in the United States? It almost even sounds like a threat. Every time these people talk about this issue, they always hinge it on the fear-mongering, right? They always hinge it on the fear and this hysteria and alarmism that there could be another 9/11. Dan Crenshaw's fond of this same tactic. He says, well, we fight them over there, so we don't have to fight them over here. Well, we don't have to fight them over here if we just didn't bring them here, right? But in any case, so he says that America can't turn its back on the region. Pulling out of the Middle East is turning our back on the region. And he says that Israel will not be safe in a world of America first. So if we put our country first, and we say America first, and we put our interests first, and that means putting our troops perhaps on the southern border instead of on the border of Syria and Turkey, he says that Israel will not be safe because we've abandoned our Kurdish allies and Iran is going to expand. And to me, this highlights the fundamental issue in our foreign policy, which is that you have the neoconservative establishment comprised largely of Jewish Zionists, and that's not everybody that is a neocon is a Jewish Zionist, but almost all the influential ones in government and in media are that. Shapiro, Bret Stephens, Bill Kristol, all these characters. Sure, Dan Crenshaw is a goy, okay? He's a white guy. He, I believe, is nominally a Christian, perhaps. I'm not sure about that. So not every neocon is a Jewish Zionist, but we understand there is an overwhelming influence, and we know why that is. The neocons are trying to push us to go to war in the Middle East to benefit who? Who is the beneficiary of all of this? Israel. The war in Iraq, the destabilization of Syria, the war in Yemen, the saber-rattling with Iran. Israel is the ultimate beneficiary. They are the one demanding and calling on us to do these things. So the fundamental distinction within the conservative movement is the reality of the neoconservative establishment and to some extent the military-industrial complex and the deep state, but primarily the Israel lobby, AIPAC, the neocons, the commentariat, influences in the DOD and the State Department. So you've got this reality of this institution which has existed on the right and prevailed for decades, and you've got the rhetoric of the Trump administration, which is America first. And these cannot coexist. Because America First says we have to pull out of the Middle East. We have to put our own country first. Our concern is America first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. That's our only concern, in fact, right? And that means that we're not going to be fighting other countries' wars. We're not even going to be concerned so much with other countries' safety. If they want to protect themselves, they can buy guns from us, right? They can, have some kind of, diplomatic relationship, but we won't fight other countries' wars. And particularly in the White House, this conflict is very apparent between the rhetoric of Donald Trump throughout the campaign and even in his administration about pulling out of useless, costly, endless wars in the Middle East, letting the Muslims fight over sand, and we're going to put America first and pull out of Syria and so on. And this influence from people like Jared Kushner, who's very much in bed with the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and all these other Zionist influences like Sheldon Adelson from the funding perspective, and the ZOA, and all this. So within the right, you have this fundamental clash. And this is one of the big debates that we've been having with Charlie Kirk, which I'll get into in a moment when we read his piece for American Greatness. But this is what we've tried to expose. People have said, oh, you're obsessed with Israel. You're fixated on Israel. Why is that your number one issue? It's not. But foreign policy is a big issue. Foreign wars, you could say, have been the biggest sin against the American people, the biggest waste, the biggest insult, in the sense that we've spent $6 trillion in 20 years fighting wars that are unwinnable and not in our own interest, while our own people die, right? Our infrastructure crumbles. We can't fund anything that actually helps our own people. So, of course, it's not to say that Israel is the fixation, but the foreign wars are, and who's sort of at the foundation of that? Who is the basis from which we have launched all these wars? Well, I think it's the Israel lobby. That is why this fundamental difference must be confronted and discussed. This issue has to be forced. And I read this from Bret Stephens, and it's actually some pretty striking intellectual honesty. He is saying, quite straightforwardly, you cannot have it both ways. You cannot have America have this unconditional support for Israel, protect Israel from all her enemies, and be America first. Israel is not safe in a world of America first. And Bret Stephens says, if Israel cannot be safe in a world of America first, then America should not be first. That's essentially what he's saying, right? And so the real takeaway is that the America First policy, according to their definition of anti-Semitism, is very implicitly and necessarily, according to their hokey definition of anti-Semitism, it must apply. Because people like Ben Shapiro and Bret Stephens have said in the past that if you're anti-Zionist, you're anti-Semitic. This is what Ben Shapiro says. Somebody asked Ben Shapiro at one of his college speeches, or maybe he was on a radio show long ago, he said, why have you said that being anti-Zionist is anti-Semitic? And Ben Shapiro gave a very interesting answer. He said that, of course, the Holocaust happened, so in order for the Jewish people to survive, they need a homeland of their own. In order for the Jewish people to survive in the homeland of their own, they have to be able to protect themselves against Iran, against other countries. And so it's a very interesting sort of chain of logic. So he says that if you are not for Israel defending itself, if you're not for America defending Israel, then he has this roundabout justification that then you are not in support of Jewish people existing, and therefore you're anti-Semitic, right? Because the argument goes that if America was not unconditionally supporting Israel, Israel could not protect herself. If Israel cannot protect herself, then the homeland of the Jewish people doesn't exist. If the homeland of the Jewish people is under threat or could not exist, well, we know that then Jews would be left to fend for themselves in the diaspora countries. And if that's the case, well, then there's no permanent existence for them. They know they're constantly under siege by governments. Anti-Semitism is this eternal threat. So that is a chain of logic. In other words, and this is his sort of QED here, is you don't support Israel, you don't support Jewish people existing. You don't support Israel defending itself or America giving this blanket security guarantee, unconditional support, then you think that Israel should be wiped off and whatever. And so that's what they're saying. They are saying that to be America first, to put America first, this is what they're saying, is implicitly anti-Semitic. And to me, that exposes the whole thing. Because what has Ben Shapiro and all the establishment called us for the past 4 weeks? What have they fixated on and honed in on? It's this anti-Semite angle, right? Holocaust denial, anti-Semite. And a lot of people hear that and they say, oh, of course we don't support anti-Semitism. Most people's first thought, their intuition is anti-Semitism means, you don't like Jewish people, right? But that's not their definition. Their definition is if America doesn't give unconditional support to Israel, that is anti-Semitism. So a lot of people hear that, Smear, and they go, oh, that's terrible. We would never support an anti-Semite. But they're coming out in this New York Times article and they're essentially saying you cannot have the coexistence of Israel and America first. Israel cannot be safe in a world where America is put first. In other words, putting America first is implicitly anti-Semitic. It is necessarily that. Now, in light of that, do you maybe have a change of heart about these accusations? Maybe does that change your perception of Ben Shapiro and when he levies those kinds of words and accusations against us? Because to me, something like this, you cannot run from that. There's no getting around that. There's no verbal trickery that will subvert that. This is the issue we're trying to force. This is what we've been trying to expose with this issue in particular. People are saying, oh, you're fixating on this issue. You're fixating on an issue which is unpopular, or, evangelicals like Israel, or, why do they care about the USS Liberty? Fundamentally, it's about this. It's forcing this question. It's forcing people like Bret Stephens to come right out and say this. And he did. He said, Israel will not be safe in an America first world. Well, if that's the case, I choose America first. I don't know about you, but I think Israel is more than capable of defending herself. Because of the foreign aid we've given them, they've developed one of the most sophisticated and advanced militaries in the world. They're one of the biggest arms exporters in the world because we've subsidized the development of their own arms contractors and their own domestic defense contractor industry. They've got one of the most powerful militaries in the Middle East, if not in the entire world. They've got one of the most sophisticated rocket defense systems, missile defense systems. They've got the only nuclear arsenal in the Middle East. Iran may or may not have a capability, but they've got the only warheads in Israel. They're more than capable of defending themselves. So I don't know about you, but if it comes to me, if the question is America first or unconditional support for Israel, I'm choosing America first. And if Bret Stephens and Ben Shapiro, and Dan Crenshaw, and Charlie Kirk, and yes, unfortunately, even if Donald Trump says the latter, well, then they cannot claim to be America first. They cannot claim to be patriots. They cannot claim to be nationalists. They cannot claim to be lovers of their country. They can't say that they have allegiance to this country because they don't. If it was any other country that this was the case, if the sentence read differently, if it said that Brazil will not be safe in an America first world, would anybody care? Would anybody bat an eye? The United Kingdom will not be safe in a world with America first. Would anybody? Oh, so what? Russia will not be safe in an America first world. People would say good. But it comes to this country, and because, 100 years ago something terrible happened, we have to have unconditional America last foreign policy. I don't think so. But this is why they're calling us anti-Semitic. You go through, and it's pretty interesting. We've been going through Ben Shapiro's old tweets from 2012, 2013, and he calls Ron Paul anti-Semitic. He calls Patrick Buchanan anti-Semitic. He calls Donald Trump anti-Semitic. Or he says that Donald Trump flirts with anti-Semites. What do they all have in common? What do they all have in common? Ben Shapiro for 15, 20 years says that Patrick Buchanan is a virile anti-Semite, a virulent, vitriolic anti-Semite. Ron Paul is a virulent anti-Semite who would strangle Jews if he could. That's what he says about Ron Paul. He says Donald Trump flirts with anti-Semites. Foreign policy is asinine. What do they all have in common? Ron Paul, Patrick Buchanan, Donald Trump, all want to put America first. Is that a coincidence? Do you think all these people, prominent, mainstream politicians, do you think they'll have Jew hatred in their hearts? Do you think they all, wake up every day and think, how am I going to come after the Jewish people? Or do you think they have postulated, or they have put forward an America first foreign policy? They've rose to prominence. They've gained notoriety, been put in a position in a lot of ways to influence foreign policy, and Ben Shapiro wants to shut it down. And Bret Stephens wants to shut it down. The Jewish Zionists want to shut it down because they want their precious Israel to be safe. Well, I don't care about Israel. I don't care about their protection. I don't care about their safety. I care about our people. And I care about our tax dollars and our security, and Israel can help themselves. So anyway, we could go on all night about that, but I think you get the point. To me, that sentence is so important. It's not at that point. It's not even about Israel and Palestine and settlements and wars that happened 40 years ago or things that happened 80 years ago. To me, it is about this fundamental distinction that must be pressed. We must force this issue because everybody wants to pretend that you can have one foot on both sides. We cannot name the Israel lobby, but in favor of America first. Doesn't work like that. Does not work like that. You can see in this administration what is happening. You can't have one foot in America first and one foot in the Israel lobby. Doesn't work like that. And case in point, look at the withdrawal from Syria. We can't even pull 1,000 troops out of Syria, a country we never belonged in to begin with, because of the influence of this lobby. And that's not America first.